I'd like to take some time today to discuss a very serious event about to take place, an event that could drastically alter the course of modern history. After receiving positive feedback from my first episode discussing the dangers of identity politics and how it can lead to genocide, I wanted to bring up a very important event that's currently unfolding in South Africa. To put it simply, South Africa might be on the verge of a race war, and certainly a civil war if the government goes through a proposed policy of confiscating land from white farmers without compensation. South Africa is mostly known for its apartheid government, but I'd like to illuminate what's currently going on, what's about to happen, and what will happen as a result. This is serious stuff and has the potential to lead into greater conflicts outside of Africa. I will provide some historical context for South Africa, what the current situation is, and how identity politics has created a climate for mass starvation and genocide. If there's one takeaway you should take from this video, it's this. Genocide is an abhorrent affront to humanity and is a sin against God. We should oppose genocide at all opportunities. Sources, of course, will be linked in the description below. But first, let's discuss the country of South Africa. Many people are familiar only with South Africa's history as it relates to the apartheid and the heroic efforts of Nelson Mandela to desegregate the country. But South Africa's history goes further back than this and is far more complex than the politics of the last 50 years. So allow me to provide you with a brief history lesson. The first European settlers in South Africa were not the English, but instead were Dutch. Dutch settlers from the Netherlands settled Cape Town as early as the 1650s and traded with the local natives. Over time, they imported thousands of slaves from Indonesia, Madagascar, and East Africa. These slaves were not indigenous to the local population and later became the Cape Coloreds, or a mixed ethnicity that spoke Dutch, later Afrikaans, and were adherents to the Dutch Reformed Church. These individuals still exist as the colored demographic, but we'll get into that later. South Africa was a Dutch colonial possession for almost 150 years before the British Empire acquired it in the early 1800s. Great Britain acquired South Africa after the last Napoleonic War and began its own colonization of English peoples in 1818. The Dutch locals, some of whom had lived there for over a century and a half, moved further inland and created two new states, the Free State of Orange and the South African Republic. They were known as the Boers, which in Dutch means farmer, and wanted to maintain their heritage and prosperity away from British colonial rule. Meanwhile, in the 1820s, Shaka Zulu began rising to power. His warring and expansionary tactics also caused the Mfecane, or the forcible migration or extermination of indigenous South African tribes in the area. While it isn't known how many of the indigenous South Africans were killed during this time, the numbers are estimated from anywhere between 1 to 2 million people, and depopulated large regions that the Dutch would later relocate to. The Zulu fought the English and the Dutch fought the Zulu and the English fought anyone that threatened their colonies, while simultaneously bringing in Indians and Asians from other parts of the empire. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi's work first began in South Africa, fighting for Indian rights in the 1920s and 1930s. Regardless, the Dutch republics of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic were absorbed by the British Empire in the early 1900s, almost 100 years after their creation, and several years before the First World War. Why? Because the regions were rich in gold and diamonds. The Dutch Boers fought wars in 1880 and again in 1899 to resist the English Empire, who literally put them into concentration camps. The Dutch Boers placed into these concentration camps were nearly universally women and children, as the Boer men were sent abroad rather than be united with their families. Approximately 26,000 women and children starved to death or died of disease in the camps before the wars were concluded. However, once integrated into the English Empire, the Boers became loyal English subjects and even fought in the First World War. However, South Africa's descent into apartheid began in 1948 when the National Party used identity politics and called for a formal, legally enforced racial separation between groups. This meant that the English and the Dutch whites, which comprised about 20% of the population at the time, would retain control of the government and all the benefits, including a higher standard of living, against all other ethnic groups. A few short years later, in 1961, South Africa became a republic and held on to apartheid after breaking away from the English Empire. International and internal forces put a lot of pressure on the government to end its racial separation, which finally ended apartheid in the early 1990s. Free elections then took place in 1994. There's a lot of history on this topic, but I'll spare you the details. Apartheid officially lasted for approximately 40 years since its ratification by the National Party, but racial divisions have always existed in this extraordinarily diverse country. However, after apartheid, hundreds of thousands of white South Africans fled the country, while millions of black Africans immigrated to the country from places like Nigeria. From 1985 to about 2015, approximately 3.9 million black Africans immigrated to South Africa, while about 650,000 white South Africans emigrated away. South Africa still maintains a sizable English citizen population, as well as workers from other European countries. A 2011 population and demographic census put the population statistics as follows. Of the country's estimated 53 million people, 40.21 million are black, 4.57 million are white, 4.54 million are colored or of the group descended from Dutch slaves, 1.27 million are either Indian or Asian, another holdover from the British Empire, and about 280,000 identify as other for their race. The indigenous South African populations are estimated to be about 1% of the country's total population, or about 530,000, and are comprised of many small tribes. So why is this so important, and what exactly is going on in South Africa? In early March of 2017, South African President Jacob Zuma called for the confiscation of land owned by white people with no restitution. Land belonging to white people would be taken away by force with no payment, and its owners would lose their property and homes. However, the South African Constitution strictly forbids such a tyrannical act, so he's proposing a vote in the South African Parliament to change the Constitution to make it legal. Zuma's political party, the African National Congress, has been losing political ground to more radical and, you guessed it, more identity politics-oriented political groups like the Economic Freedom Fighters Party, who advocate intense anti-white bigotry through property theft. You can take my word for it, or you can browse through the dozens of articles on places like genocidewatch.com, which outline anti-white murders and brutality, to the 2011 court case that ruled the song Shoot the Boer was considered hate speech and was thus banned from the ANC party from singing it at their rallies. Jacob Zuma's land confiscation and constitutional change will be voted on in Parliament in April of this year. As I stated in my first video, politics like those in South Africa were mimicked in the Bosnian War, which led to genocide, massive refugee migrations, and untold human misery. As also stated, the safest place for any minority is in the nation-state that can protect against tyranny through the courts and due process, like the South African courts did in 2011 against the Kill the Boer song. But when identity politics is magnified, order and allegiance breaks down along racial and ethnic lines, which inevitably leads to war. But the worst part about all of this? No one remembers what happened when Zimbabwe did the exact same thing in 2002. Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe's long-term tyrannical dictator, did the exact same policy as currently proposed in South Africa and confiscated white farmers' property in 2002. This was to distract against a depressed economy and galvanize popular support towards his wildly unpopular and brutal dictatorship. So what happened? The country became more racially violent, poverty and inflation ballooned out of control, and the population endured a famine so bad that by 2006, large segments of the population were eating rats to survive, a trend that continues to this day. But in a twist of irony, in 2015, Robert Mugabe made a request for white farmers to return, since the inexperienced black farmers could not produce the same yields as their more experienced white counterparts. As South Africa is poised to do, Zimbabwe went from being a prosperous post-colonial state to a land of grinding poverty, ethnic hatred, mass starvation, and death. Like Zimbabwe's dictator Mugabe, President Zuma is operating in an unpopular regime in a depressed economy with a 26% unemployment rate and is looking for a scapegoat to blame. My point here is that land confiscation for justice or to fight some historical wrong has always ended in grinding poverty, ethnic hatred, mass starvation, and death. It didn't work when Russian Soviets rounded up Kulak peasant farmers and sent them to Siberian death camps. It didn't work when the Khmer Rouge attempted to create a pastoral utopia in Cambodia. It didn't work when Hugo Chavez did it for equality in Venezuela, and it didn't work with Fidel Castro's crusade against capitalism in Cuba either. All of these countries were food exporters before the land confiscation, and all of them devolved into poverty-stricken, famine-dominated, murderous hellholes afterward. Cuba went from having more heads of cattle than people on the island before the revolution to being so starved for beef, no pun intended, that killing a single head of cattle will land you 4 to 10 years in prison. Unauthorized consumption of beef in Cuba will also get you a year in prison, by the way. But I must ask this question. How exactly will white land confiscation put right the wrongs of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa? I mean, out of all of the South African populations, don't the Dutch Boers have the most right to the land? After all, weren't they a minority persecuted and exterminated by a colonial government? Don't they have the right to a land they've inhabited for nearly 400 years? That's almost twice the history of the United States. Surely they must have some claim to the land after all that time. And don't the indigenous populations that make up only about 530,000 people also deserve something from the Zulu, who caused millions of them to die through Shaka Zulu and the Eastern African kingdoms? And what about the colored population and the Asians/Indians? Weren't they brought there against their will as slaves or under British imperialism? Whose land do you confiscate for them? And do you deport them, since they're also colonists, if you will, to a pre-colonial South Africa? Where would you even deport them to? And what about the more recent 3.9 million black African immigrants that arrived in the past 30 years? By President Zuma's logic, aren't they in fact colonists of a different sort? And don't they owe something to contribute in reparations toward a pre-colonial South Africa? How on earth do you create a just pre-colonial society with such a complicated history? In the end, President Zuma is proposing tyrannical actions against a racial minority to steal their wealth and property. This is wrong no matter what ethnicity is involved. You can argue historical dialectics all you want, but what troubles me the most is how rapidly the situation in South Africa could turn into a bona fide race war. Just as people were lumped into Catholic Croat, Orthodox Serb, and Muslim Bosniak in the Bosnian War, South Africans will be lumped into white, black, mixed, or Asian/Indian in a race war. Gone is the rich, complex history and humanity of your neighbors and countrymen. Instead, a person is rendered down to their skin tone in the most racist and bigoted terms. And the end results? Well, we've already seen what happened in Zimbabwe and Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia was a small Eastern European country of only a few million people. South Africa has a growing population of well over 53 million people. Survivalist Boer groups like the Suidlanders have long banded together for mutual protection and have put together contingency plans in the event of a genocidal war. What further concerns me is how a situation like this could potentially spiral out of control into other countries as well. Black Lives Matter, the New Black Panthers, La Raza, or any other identity politics organization could find themselves the center of new racially motivated violence with the ensuing death that accompanies it. And will the international press attempt to defend South Africa's actions against the colonial whites if the South African Constitution is changed? Do we really want to attempt to defend or justify race war and genocide if it's directed against white people? Do they really think a changed constitution to illegally confiscate property won't ever be used again on a different minority? Do they think the dismissal of constitutional protections won't result in a more tyrannical and oppressive government? Do we really want to go through all of this again and repeat the massive human misery that took place in Yugoslavia and Zimbabwe? The truth is, genocide is wrong no matter who commits it. Genocide is an abhorrent affront to humanity and is sin against God. Whether it's the genocide of Muslims in Myanmar by Buddhist extremists, it's wrong. Whether it's the slaughter and enslavement of Yazidi and Christian populations by ISIS Muslims, it's wrong. Whether it's by black South Africans confiscating land and killing white South Africans, or the White National Party in 1948 legislating apartheid, genocide is wrong. So the question is, what do we do about it? If we know South Africa is standing on the precipice of catastrophe with genocide and starvation, what can we do about it? Well, I could tell people to write their representatives or senators, but I suspect very few actually would. I could ask you to consider donating money to the Suidlander survivalist groups, but I suspect I would be accused of being a racist if I did. I could tell you to inform your friends and community about what's going on in South Africa and of the potential of racial genocide, but I suspect most people just simply don't want to hear it and wouldn't believe you anyway. Instead, I'm reminded of a poem by Rudyard Kipling called The Wrath of the Awakened Saxon. Rudyard Kipling has written some excellent works during the apex of European colonization, and I'd like to read it here for you and leave you with his words. It was not part of their blood. It came to them very late, with long arrears to make good, when the Saxon began to hate. They were not easily moved. They were icy, willing to wait, till every count should be proved ere the Saxon began to hate. Their voices were even and low. Their eyes were level and straight. There was neither sign nor show when the Saxon began to hate. It was not preached to the crowd. It was not taught by the state. No man spoke it aloud when the Saxon began to hate. It was not suddenly bred. It will not swiftly abate. Through the chilled years ahead, when time shall count from the date that the Saxon began to hate. I'm Iron Liz, and thanks for listening. If you like the content of my podcasts, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe below. The bigger the audience I can spread the heresy toward, the better. You can also follow me on Twitter at Iron Liz. Once again, I'm Iron Liz, and thanks for listening.